All right, well, hopefully we have our audience online and we have our wonderful audience here in person. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth. So good evening.
Is it recording?
It is recording. It's been recording for 30 minutes. So we are on top of things. So anyway, good evening and welcome back to your educational home. You've joined our Cal History Series event, and each month we gather together to discuss historical events and cultural ideologies. I'm Katie McKinney. I'm the founder of and head of school for the Classical Academy de Lafayette, and we're a private school in Wentzville, Missouri, serving kindergarten through 11th grade. And next year we will grow to 12th grade, and we will have our first graduation. We're very excited. So we're glad you're here and continuing your historical learning with us and Mr. Preston. So now on to Mr. Preston. The inspiration for the subject tonight is rooted in his past. When he first read the creditable political minds predicting that the control of the two lawmaking houses of Congress was likely to be at least split between the two parties, he was reminded of when there was a divided government in his own home. In the spring of 1968, Mr. Preston heard into the wee hours of the morning a very energetic debate between his father, a U.S. Marine Corps Korean War vet, and his New York City raised mother over politics. They usually agreed on everything, but in those days, his father was concerned about the spread of communism and how Vietnam was at the front line of that fight. His mother had seen enough footage of young men returning home in metal caskets from what seemed to be a never-ending war. She did not want that to be her sons, of course. Two of them, right? You and
my brother
and your brother. So somehow, even Mr. Preston's house with a divided government, there were plenty of other things that his parents, somehow, even in Mr. Preston's house with a divided government, there were still plenty of other things his parents were of one mind on, and things did get done. Tonight, his presentation will begin with a deep dive into our political DNA. He's going to discuss our constitutional roots, further explaining why we are unique in the world, in addition to being one of the first, obviously, to rely on systems where people choose their own government. The only thing we have to fear, he says, is our news and our social media outlets. So our talk this evening is going to focus on the curious history of a U.S. under divided government. So please welcome Mr. Preston.
Thank you, Mrs. McKinney, and welcome to all those who are watching online and to our friends who came out there on another January night here in St. Louis, living up to the reputation St. Louis has. If you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. Because not too long ago, we were in the 60s, and now got 20-mile-per-hour winds in the 30s and high 20s probably coming up. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to give a lot of background in this, and some of it's going to mirror any of you who have middle schoolers in my class here at Classical Academy at Lafayette. We just had a 6-week block leading up to Christmas break, talking about the Constitution. And that's important to understand because we often compare ourselves to other countries. And the fact of the matter is that we're unlike any other country that uses democratic means in order to choose its elected representatives. And so it's important to understand how that's going to work. And I'm going to try to make this work here. Okay. Yes, it will. That's all we need. Okay, so our system is designed unlike other republics or other democratic institutions, parliaments, etc., around the world. In that, and it's because of our origin. We often think of the Revolutionary War happening, we win the war, the British give up, and next thing you know, we have the United States of America. Wrong. What we have after the peace of Paris in 1783 is 13 little republics who have kind of a friendship agreement. We're going to get along well. Yes, of course we are. But meanwhile, I'm from Massachusetts, that's my country. I'm from South Carolina, that's my country. And we'll get together when we need to. Now, the kind of government that supposedly we had during the time from the Declaration of Independence to the end of the war was we're all united on one thing. We don't want to be part of Great Britain anymore. But once that was no longer going on, as our middle schoolers learned in the 6-week unit we had, we needed a new government. And part of understanding the kind of government that we ended up with is why we needed a new government and what we expected that new government to do. What had to happen to take these 13 republics and get some sort of nation out of it. Now, part of this came about because of the process that we had set up. Those guys had actually kind of pulled a fast one on these 13 republics. They were sent to Philadelphia to fix this original government set up under something called the Articles of Confederation. It was just kind of a league of friendship was really what it was. And they get there and they say, okay, we're not going to talk about what we're doing. We're not going to release anything to the press. We're going to keep it close to the vest. And for a number of months, people didn't know what they were up to. And one of the first things that happened there is they decided, we can't fix this old government. We're going to have to start from scratch with something new. And yet they knew when it was over, they were going to have to get the states to agree to it. And so when the Constitution was finished and this new government was written up as to how it was going to be divided, how the powers were going to be divided, next thing happens is the states have to ratify it. They have to say, yes, we agree with it. And without going through the whole class again, this was a difficult situation where there were many times when it seemed like the whole situation was going to end. Massachusetts was the first one which was probably going to reject the Constitution. So was New York. So was Virginia. A lot of them were going to reject it. And part of what made it work is they agreed to make some changes. Those changes eventually became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we call the Bill of Rights. Without an agreement to consider a Bill of Rights and to begin to suggest amendments, we probably would not have had that Constitution ratified, and that would not have become the law of the land. So, as had been before and during the Revolution, the question in the Constitution that they debated the most about was, how are we going to do representation? Now, under the original Articles of Confederation, the representation was by state. Each state vote on its own. You didn't have individuals who voted a certain way in the first Congress. You had states that voted that way. And nothing could get done unless all 13 states agreed. We know how often that happens in this country. So the idea of how are we going to make sure we have something which can get a little more done than we were able to get done with the Articles of Confederation is one of the first big questions. So when they get there, one guy is all ready to suggest, here's my blueprint. I know everyone's going to, change parts of it, stuff like that, but here's my suggestion. And that's James Madison, who we today call the father of the Constitution, although it looks very different in the end than what Madison started with. But the main thing that Madison started with is we should have representation by population. Okay? In other words, the state with the most number of people should have the most number of representatives, and so forth. Now, the problem with this is the small states who were there right away said, that's a non-starter. We're never going to agree to something like that. We'll just get rolled over. Connecticut, Rhode Island didn't even show up. They said, we know what's going on there. We're not even going to show up. Okay. So Connecticut had to somehow be won over. New Jersey would have been considered a small state. Certainly New Hampshire would have been considered a small state. And especially if it's going to be by population. It's not even so much the size of the state, but how many people are in there, if that's the way it's going to be. And that's a lot of the fight early on in the Constitutional Convention. And there's a reason why I'm spending all this time explaining this to you before I get into our divided government. It's going to explain how we got to that point and why we so often seem to have these struggles that go on in our Congress. And people say, well, Congress isn't getting anything done. Folks, I hate to tell you, that's by design, okay? And I'm going to explain to you why it's by design. So the smaller states said, it's going to be by population. We can go home now. No. We'll figure something out. Now, the next thing as they're fighting over representation is we're going to have two houses now in the Congress. Now, some people said, I've heard this story before, and immediately they thought of the British Parliament. House of Lords, House of Commons. No, we didn't fight this war to get free from England to act like them. They said, no, this is going to be different. And so they continued to discuss what each one of these houses in Congress would do. And that's when, and again, I'm cutting the thing short here. Eventually, they came up with something that's been known as the Great Compromise. And what was really smart is the guy who presented the Great Compromise to everyone at the convention is a guy from one of the smaller states, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. He's one of the unsung heroes. By the way, Roger Sherman's the only one who signed all the major documents that were part of the revolutionary history. He signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and a Declaration about Religious Liberty that was done early on. So he's one of the few guys that's been there at all these places and been involved in all the discussions. So what is the Great Compromise? We're going to have two houses. One of them is going to be done the way that Madison's suggestion, by population. We call that the House of Representatives, okay? And the other one's going to be by states. And each state's going to be equal. And this was part of the deal when they all agreed to the Constitution. Every once in a while I hear, well, the Senate's not fair. It's not fair that California gets the same number of votes, 2 senators, as Wyoming, which has only 500,000 people, and California has, 40 million or whatever it happens to be. So no, that's part of what everyone agreed to. That's part of what everyone agreed to when the 13 original states ratified the Constitution, and everyone that's been admitted since then, they know that's the rules, okay? California wasn't held at gunpoint to join the Union. The fact of the matter is they applied, were accepted. These are the rules, and there's a reason for it. And the reason is so that you don't have the big time, heavy populated, urban center dominated states rolling over all the other states who have very different needs than the big urban states do. And so there's a reason for that. Anyway, I'll get more into that as we go through our presentation here about the way things work out. Okay, so most of the time when you look back at American history, we have had divided government. And one of the reasons for that is, I told you about the two houses, one by population, one by states, but also something that we do that's unusual is we have a separate election for our chief executive. Okay? So you may have a whole time where a chief executive actually has, 8 years, 2 full terms, and never has complete control of Congress. In fact, a lot of the times what happens is somebody gets elected. Maybe it's what we call a wave election. They thought the last one was going to be a wave election. And he gets both houses of Congress and the presidency. And almost inevitably, in the next by-election, 2 years later, they lose one of those houses. It's just the way, and I don't think there's anything calculated in the way the American people do it. We just always kind of want to keep things balanced out. We don't want these guys going too far over here, and we don't want these guys going too far over here. We like to have the balance in there. And so that's why I put in here this little on the side. The purpose of the United States Constitution is to limit the power of the federal government, not the American people. The idea is to constantly remind them that the people who are in charge are not the elected officials. It's the people who are electing the officials. Okay? So we have divided government by design to some extent. One of the key things that the framers took when they set up this 3-branch government, this was an idea by Baron de Montesquieu, which was the way to keep there from being a tyrannical power or one branch having too much power is to make sure that there are other branches that offset them. So almost everything that happens in our government, in the end, one way or another, is going to involve all 3 branches. The 3 branches being the executive branch, the president runs that, the legislative branch, Congress running that, and then the judicial branch, where the Supreme Court is the ultimate thought. So how does this play out? When there's an opening on the Supreme Court, president appoints, Senate approves, now you've got a new person on the Supreme Court. President does something which is unconstitutional. Supreme Court can call that out. The Congress does something which is unconstitutional. Supreme Court can call that out. And of course, they've all had a hand in the makeup of that Supreme Court. The people have had a hand in the makeup of that Congress. And the people have had a hand in the makeup of who's running the executive branch. So in all these things, by design, you're going to have the people involved somewhere or another in setting who are the players in these 3 branches of power. Now, Americans have been, through the length of our existence, suspicious of concentrations of power. We talk about that all down. Well, this group has too much power. Or, what if the president does this? What's going to stop him from doing this? And well, Congress can stop him from doing that. Or the Supreme Court can say this is unconstitutional. And this is because, and I've used this before and I've talked about this country, this is part of our national DNA. We fought the greatest power in the world at that time and ended up getting our independence. We were suspicious of anything that smacks like a king. I'm getting ready right now in a couple of weeks to talk to the middle schoolers about Andrew Jackson. And he was the most powerful president who's ever used the powers of the presidency at that time when he 8 years that he was president. And oftentimes his opponents called him King Andrew I, knowing that that's the kind of thing that people would respond to. Anything that smacked of being a king was something they were suspicious of and had a negative reaction to. And then we're still that way. You'll hear people complain. They'll complain about the president or complain about their governor or whatever it is, if they think they're being too king-like, if they feel they're not responding to the will of the people. So Americans have fought a long war, a costly war against a king. They had freed themselves from an all-powerful government, a king and a parliament that they had no representation in. And each state's citizens thought of their state as their country. And particularly in the South, to them, that didn't change that much when they agreed to this Constitution. And I'm talking to the kids about this now so that they understand when we get to the Civil War, what you really have happening, yes, slavery is a huge part of it. Slavery is an example of how it got to that point. But you had two very different ideas in mind about what that Constitution meant when they ratified it. To the South, what they were getting was an assurance that they could trade between states, they could trade with other foreign powers, they would have the protection of a national army and a national navy, but they thought that most of the power stayed with the states. So they worried a lot less about Washington, except how it could mess things up in their lives. And they were much more focused on what was going on in their state government and their governors and the such. And that actually continues to be something pretty strongly held today, particularly in the South. People are much more concerned with what's going on with their local and state government than they are about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Very different when you go north of the Mason-Dixon line and the way that people look at things in the north. In the West, they're a little more like a combination between the two. Some of the things we need federal help with, managing our land and handling the native populations that are on the reservations and such. But as far as other things, they want the federal government to stay out of it. We want our water rights. We want to be able to have a free range. We want to be able to not have them interfere with the way that we want to run our lands. Now, Western is much more of a libertarian land, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. So they designed this new government to restrain the power of government, to make sure that they had enough to protect them against Spain and France and Great Britain, but at the same time, that would allow them the blessings of liberty that they felt they had fought this war for. And many of them were suspicious that this federal government would at some point in time be very much like the king and parliament, that they'd gotten rid of England. Those people who were against ratifying this Constitution were known at the time as anti-federalists. And I believe to a great extent, you can still see strains of this in the American politics. There are people who have brought back their own version of the things written by people like George Mason and Patrick Henry and other people who are famous anti-federalists. They were against the ratification of the Constitution, and their concern was too much concentration in power in this new federal government, not enough restrictions on it. Over time, it will encroach on state power. And we'll see that play out as we see the idea of divided government in the United States play out in this position. Okay, Federalist number 51 is where James Madison tried to convince people, look, they're not going to be too powerful. I'm very much a person of the same mind. I want the states to continue to have power. But the way that we've divided things up here, we think we've got a balance, and we think there's enough protections on federal power. And of course, in the end, that comes down to how the people, through their elected representatives, continue to manage this. Are they aware of the dangers of too much concentration of their power? Are they aware when it's happening? Do they push back when it's happening? And some of that is what we're seeing today. Over the last couple of years, how many of you agree? We've seen more discussion about what's going on in schools and in school boards and in local boards than we've ever seen before. And a lot of it is because of things that we see trending across the country. And they say, well, that may be fine for California, but not in my hometown or not in my school district or whatever it happens to be. And we're going to see that play out as we go through this presentation all well. Okay. One of the key things that Madison said, and I love it when I hear all these politicians say, well, we've got to look out and protect our democracy. Number one, and I always say this to people, we do not have a democracy, and that is by design. Madison called democracy the tyranny of the majority. Now, I get funny looks at the students when I say these things like that, so I make sure that I have time to explain it to them, because they've been brought up to think democracy, good, we want a democracy, we live in a democracy. No, no, and no, okay? We are not a democracy, we are a republic. And why is that? Because democracy is majority rules. Well, isn't that good? The kids kind of look at me and say, and I say, well, let's use an example of that. You're driving in the car, you're going to go have dinner somewhere, and mom turns around and says, all right, the four of you decide where we're going to go for dinner. And three of them want to go to McDonald's and one of them is a vegan. Okay, so that's going to be an unfortunate majority rules decision. I'm honestly kidding, but you get the idea. When you have majority rules, to the framers, majority rule means the mob. One of the reasons the Constitution happens is because something called the Shays Rebellion up in Massachusetts. And what it was a revolt by those who had borrowed money to buy their farmland and the people that they owed it to. And of course, they'd been gone off fighting the revolution for a while, and so they were behind. And so as they come back home and they're not able to catch up, the lender says, you've either got to get up to date, or I'm going to take my money and the land back as it. And there was a revolt. And that revolt almost succeeded. And that would have been bad if it had, because if you have a situation where the people who are the decision makers are a small group and everyone else says, hey, who's in favor of not having to own our land anymore? Oh, raise your hand, say aye. And of course, that would be the majority, and that would wipe out the people who'd lent the money, and then you can't have a functioning capitalist system. So to the framers, democracy meant the mob. So they didn't want that. It was just a way for the majority to get its way, whether it's property or making rules for themselves. So what's the difference in a republic? In a republic, you have to have laws that everyone has to follow, even the majority. It protects the minority against the tyranny of the majority. Otherwise, you can't function, and the minority will always be losing their rights to the majority. And so there are certain restrictions that we're going to put on the federal government. The majority says, we're going to take our land back. No, you've got to go through a process. And that process is going to protect the rights of the person who lent you that money, as well as protecting the borrower. And that's why we set up those rules. And that's something that comes out of American system, the fact that we're going to have a republic with laws that everyone has to follow, even the most powerful person. And we can see that because we've just seen the former president of the United States have his tax returns released against his will, but they went through a whole process, and in the end, the process ended up saying this is going to happen, and it happened. So no matter who you are answerable to our legal system. Okay, so the Constitution is full of things to super protect a minority. There are a number of things that cannot happen without a super majority. An example is impeachment. And we've now had several impeachments over the last number of years. Who knows if we're going to get more. And in order to be convicted in that impeachment and removed from your office, it takes a 2/3 majority. So in other words, it has to be a super majority and not just, one political party is taking control and now we're going to get rid of the people in the other political party because that's what we want to do. No, you're going to have to get some people from the other party to agree, because it's going to take that in order for a conviction on an impeachment. And getting a ratification of the Constitution. I'm one of those people that hears once in a while, hey, we need to have a convention of states to suggest new amendments to the Constitution. And people go, oh, who knows what kind of scary things could come out of that. Doesn't make any difference what scary things is. They all have to get 38 states to agree to it. It has to have a 3/4 majority. And that's why look at the amendments to the Constitution. We've got 27. The first 10 happened 2 years afterwards. The Bill of Rights. And it took another 200 years to get another 17, some of which were obvious when we look at them. We go, getting rid of slavery, 13th Amendment, that's obvious. Getting women the vote, that's obvious. 18-year-olds getting the vote, which some people are saying now, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But it made sense because if you were going to draft them and send them to Vietnam, then they have the right to vote on whether that's a good idea or not. They should be part of that decision as to whether or not we should be there. And that's why that happened. The 18-year-old vote happened in 1973 at the height of the Vietnam War. And because people had made the logical conclusion that if they're going to have to get drafted and go to Vietnam, then they should have the right to vote on whether or not they agree with that position. Okay, so super majority in the states on amendments to the Constitution. Senate approval of treaties takes 2/3 of the Senate to approve a treaty. Ask Woodrow Wilson, who never was able to get us to agree to the Versailles Treaty to end World War I. How many people know that we had a separate peace with Germany at the end of World War I? Yeah, Wilson was not able to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to it. And the reason was because there were conditions in there where we could have been asked to come back in under hostilities. And America, going all the way back to George Washington's farewell address, which my middle schoolers have just learned about in the last week or so, have been told by George Washington, avoid entangling alliances, stay out of the affairs of Europe. The only reason we got in World War I is because when the submarine warfare got so bad, we figured we had to get involved in that in order to stop that. But the fact of the matter is, it, again, is part of our national DNA to not get involved in those things. And so it takes 2/3 of the Senate to approve any treaty in Congress. And the last one that was a big one that got rejected was the Versailles Treaty. We are not a co-signee. Wilson, it was a big part of what he did there when he went over to negotiate that in Versailles, and he was so proud of it when he came back, but it doesn't make any difference. In America, it takes 2 steps. This is one reason why they did the Iran deal the way they did. Well, we're not going to call it a treaty because they knew they'd never get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to it. So they just kind of made it a presidential thing, which the next president came in, Mr. Trump, and said, nope, not part of the Iran deal anymore. Now they're trying to turn that back on. What a mess. But anyway, that's the way that's supposed to be. Overriding a presidential veto has got to be a 2/3 majority in both houses in order to override a veto. In other words, it's got to be really clear that the majority of the people's representatives are against what the president is doing in order to override a presidential veto. And there's been lots of times when that's happened, but it's been very clear that the country, right or wrong, felt very differently about that. Because again, what are those people? They're representatives of the voters. Every once in a while I get people come up to me and say, can you believe what Congressman so-and-so said? Or can you believe what Senator so-and-so said? I said, well, if they're not representing the views of their voters, they will get voted out next time. But a lot of times we're talking about people who've been there a long time. They keep getting voted, which says something, because they're representing the views of their voters. And we may think it's unusual, but that's obviously the voters are very happy with what the person is saying and doing. And then we have the Senate filibuster. Now, the filibuster is not in the Constitution, but it's been part of the Senate rules. One of the things in the Constitution is that each house makes its own rules. That fight that we saw about whether or not you were going to have the speaker, whether he was going to get elected, that really wasn't about him. They all knew he was eventually going to get elected. What it was about was negotiating new rules that the House would run in order to do its business over the next 2 years. Now, maybe I should say this toward the end, but I'm just going to say it right now. This divided government we have right now is not atypical. In fact, it's rather typical. And that is the number one thing you expect is that pretty much nothing's going to get done for the next 2 years. And, whether that was intentional or not, they all know that pretty much now, Mr. Biden will get just about any judge that he wants to get agreed to. He'll nominate federal judges. They have a 1-vote majority in the Senate, so they'll get all those people put onto the court system throughout the country. Remember, federal judges are there for life or till they retire. But nothing much will happen in the House of Representatives because they've been elected by enough of their representatives, their voters back home, to stop what's going on right now. And then everyone will sit back and take a look in 2 years from now and make decisions about what direction they want the country to go. So the November 2024 election will be a big one because it will be a decision as far as the Congress is concerned. And of course, you'll have a chance again to decide whether or not do we want to reelect the president or do we want to choose somebody else to take his place based on what's going on. So the Senate filibuster is part of their rules. Now everybody says, why is the filibuster even there? I heard people saying, well, is there always to be racist and do the Senate filibuster may have been used by people at some point in time in our nation's history to prevent, for instance, civil rights legislation. But to a great extent, what they're trying to do is get a workable majority of representatives of the states to put something forward before it goes through. In other words, if you can't get 60 senators to say this is a good idea and that they're going to go ahead and vote on it, then what you usually expect to happen is maybe if we make this change, make this adaptation, make this compromise, now we'll get 60 people to agree. It's to force compromise. That's why you have the filibuster in the Senate. It's to force compromise. And over time, it used to be 2/3. So you had to have 67 senators. Well, a lot of stuff wasn't getting done. Then they lowered it a little more. Right now it's 60. And remember, all it is not a vote on a bill. It's a vote on whether they're going to vote on a bill. It's called a cloture vote. So until they get 60 votes that agree to cloture, to agree to stop debate and start having a debate on the actual bill, that's what the filibuster does. Anybody that's ever seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington has seen the fun Hollywood version of that. And it's still good. I used to show it to my government classes because it was fun to watch, at least the way the process worked in 1939. I don't think it comes anywhere close to that today, but that's the way it worked in 1939. So that's why the Senate has the filibuster, not being in the Constitution. Now, I want you to take a look at this. When we think about the United States and we think, boy, our system's a mess. Oh, yeah? These are two countries that are very familiar to us. And this is the makeup of their legislature today. The top is the Israeli Knesset, which usually is something like it's a 48, 47 type of majority type of situation. Well, how does that happen? As you can see, the biggest ones have like 19 out of the 100 or so seats that are in the Knesset. So they have to get some of these other little teeny parties to say, join our coalition. I'll make you Ministry of Finance, or I'll make your leader Ministry of Labor, or whatever it happens to be. And that's the way they form these coalition governments. And right now, Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think this is either his third or fourth bite of the apple as being prime minister. Third, okay, thank you. And so what these guys have to get these coalitions to agree. You think 20 guys holding up a speakership was a big deal? And that's nothing compared to the background that's going on in these kind of things. Here's the Italian one. I don't know how many people have seen the Italian prime minister lately. I think she's pretty impressive. If you haven't seen Giorgia Meloni, she's interesting. Obviously, it's Italy, and the hands move a lot. But the fact of the matter is that she's done quite a bit. Am I getting in trouble for that? She's done quite a bit to pull together enough of these other parties to be able to get a majority in that Senate. And Italy, I don't know the number. Somebody here probably knows it, but governments have been falling in Italy every 3 weeks, 4 months, whatever. The Italians are constantly going there. I mean, the Communist Party still has a significant structure there. And so it's these kind of places are what happens when you have parliaments, when you have to have a governing body, your legislature, whatever it is, and then the prime minister is going to be the leader of the largest party in that coalition. Britain's kind of starting to go that way now with the weakening of the Conservative Party, the rise of the Labour Party, the Liberal Party. There's a fourth one, I forget, that Nigel Farage and some of his guys are putting together. But as you subdivide like that, it gets harder and harder to get things done. And the prime minister usually has a lot more things that he has to make promises on in order to get things done. Now, majority of the party gets its way most of the time and gets to pass laws. But if not, you got to form a coalition, which means, it's sometimes walking through a minefield, trying to get some of the things that they're trying to get passed. So that causes a constant situation where the government's fallen, no confidence in whoever the leader is. We're going to have a new election, and it doesn't give a lot of stability. Israel, Italy, and now even I think Great Britain has kind of show some weaknesses there. Fringe parties can wield power out of proportion of how many people. They might have a party that has only 3 delegates, but those 3 delegates are enough to put you in a majority position. And so now the leader of the coalition has to offer them something to encourage them to join their coalition. We don't go through that. I always hear people once in a while say, it's time for a third party. It's time for you can't have a third party succeed in this country. We tried it several times. Most recent, remember Ross Perot? Yeah, can I finish? The fact of the matter is the Reform Party was never going to be a substantial third party because you have to have significant representation in all 50 states to be part of any kind of discussion, to be part of any debate, to be part of any constant struggle between the two. Even in the states where the Democratic Party is the minority party in a very small minority, or the Republican Party is, they usually get somewhere around 30 or 40%. And the highest you had during Ross Perot's first run, I think he got 19% overall. In some states, he got close to 50%. But he didn't get a single delegate in the Electoral College because he didn't win any states. And you have to win states in our system. So it's highly unlikely we're ever going to see a third party. What usually happens is one of the parties begins to die, and out of its ashes, and some other people are unhappy in the other party, they come together and you get one party. It's hard for our system to support more than 2 parties. Some could argue that we're not supporting 2 parties, but the fact of the matter is it's difficult to do that. Okay. So why did the framers choose this constitutional system with all these checks and balances and all these difficulties to get something done instead of a straight democracy? And as I said, I always ask my students, what is the name of this country? It's the United States of America. When we formed the Constitution, the agreement was made. The federal government will have the powers that we state in these 4 or 5 pages. The rest of it, as the 10th Amendment says, will stay either with the states or with the people. And that's actually the wording of the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And we're not terribly aware of that as a citizenry. And this is why I feel so strongly about, history teaching, obviously, but also understanding the civics of how your country works. And young people think, I don't care about that. I'm busy doing this all day. I really don't care about the government. You will when you start paying taxes. Am I right or am I right? And that does change a lot of it. Now you have a stake in it. You get married and you have children. You have a stake in what they're teaching in your schools. You have a stake in what the law is and is not enforcing. You have a stake in what decisions are made that affect your everyday life as you're trying to make things work. So, I would like to have them have more information before they go out into the world, especially so that sometimes they can say, well, actually, that's not true. That's not the way it is. I learned what it is. And here's what's in Article 2 or something like that. Okay. And we work on that in our class. So this is why we want to have this, instead of a democracy, we want a constitutional republic. So this is an old part of a comedian used to do a thing like this, go halfway through his comedy routine. He said, so I told you this story to tell you this. So I told you all this story to tell you this. And that is the most important aspect of divided government will be seen at the state and local levels. Now, most people wouldn't have believed that for the last 20, 30 years, but you're starting to see it now, because that's where people are realizing how government can help and how government interferes with the way they want to run their lives. And of course, certainly the things that we're hearing about that's going on in some of the schools. We're hearing some pretty outrageous things out of Virginia. How would you like to have sent your kids to one of the top schools around, and the school purposely kept from the knowledge of the parents and the student that this student had won a number of awards and merit scholarship and everything, and they kept that quiet? That's going to reverberate as that story begins to get out, and Governor Youngkin is already starting to address that, and it's hitting a wider thought in the educational system, who are trying to go from a merit system to a identity politics system. And I think parents are going to push back on that. We'll see if they are. For almost 100 years, state and local elections were nationalized. Particularly, you would see that from onto the New Deal and things like that. But for the most part, we thought about what was going on with national politics in Washington. And I think we're kind of returning to that now. We're returning to a time when we want to see what government can and can't do and should not be doing. And that in order for that to happen, parents are going to have to get involved, individuals, grandparents. I'm certainly concerned about what's going on with my grandchildren. Fortunately, I have one of them here at Cal, and she loves it absolutely. And she, as far as I'm concerned, she's an exact representation of why students should be going to a school like Cal. But I think we're seeing a gradual reversal of that. Okay, so if we are, why is that happening? Again, the 10th Amendment strikes back. There are plenty of laws and rules and executive orders that come out of Washington, D.C. And we saw that recently with COVID. COVID brought a lot of this into focus with people. Masks, mandates, etc. We moved in the middle of the whole thing from St. Louis County to St. Charles County. And my wife and I used to jokingly say, to my children who were back in St. Louis County, well, I'm going back to my home in free St. Charles County where I can go to the Waffle House and I don't have to wear a mask and all that sort of stuff. And we're starting to see people push back and ask questions and see, are the experts really as expert as they say they are? And again, this is not anti-government stuff. The whole purpose is that we are the bosses. And they represent us, and they work for us. And when they forget that, we have the chance to remind them that. It's called an election. And those are the kinds of things I think you're starting to see on the ground level. You're starting to see people getting more involved in the school boards and asking questions of the teachers' unions. The whole concept of the trans issues these days, who should be allowed to go into which bathroom, should we be able to have guys who are essentially guys participating in girls' sports teams? All of this has become politicized, but it's also awakened people up as to what's going on in the government and the officials that they elected to represent them. Are they representing their views? And so the local government is really ending up being the first line of conflict in what people refer to as the culture wars. I don't know if that's a fair term to use, but that's certainly the term that's being thrown around these days. Now, it used to not matter. Congress was everything. In other words, if you look at the 19th century, with the exception of an Andrew Jackson because of who he was, and Abraham Lincoln because of the Civil War, there's a whole slew of presidents in there that most of you could look at and say, I have no idea what Millard Fillmore did. Who was Benjamin Harrison? And should I be upset that Garfield was shot? Because these are people that you don't have anything in your mind that says, oh, well, if it hadn't been for Garfield, I don't know. And so it was Congress that was really running the show. And when the Constitution was designed, that's what they expected because they were the ones closest to the people. Every 2 years, your congressman goes back and asks you to rehire him. Okay? Most of them get rehired. Maybe if we thought more about it, fewer of them would get rehired. But that's up to the voters. Well, again, that's up to the voters. Again, if they're representing the views of their people, then that's all that's important. People come up to Cori Bush said, but she's representing the views of the people that voted for her. Okay? And that's their decision to make. That's our system. And aren't we glad that it is that way? Because a lot of them would like some of us probably to vote the way that we do, but that's our system. We have the right to express our votes the way they are. Anyway, George Washington set the tone. He knew that it was different being a president as opposed to being the general of the army. And so he knew that everything he did was going to set a precedent. And the kids laugh when I do this because they know that I'm coming to this. I said, he's the president who did what? He set a precedent. Yes. Everything he was doing was going to say, this is kind of what you can expect from a president. In fact, FDR almost didn't get the run for that third term because everyone said 2 terms was enough for George Washington. Who do you think you are, FDR? Better than George Washington? but it was during the war, and I think that probably had a difference. Anyway, everything was a precedent, and the intention was that the power was going to be in Congress. It's the people's voice. That's where bills are going to be passed. You didn't have a lot of presidents writing executive orders in those days. You had Congress passing a bill, and then for the most part, presidents rarely vetoed. In fact, the first guy really to do any serious vetoing was Andrew Jackson. He knew better than everybody else, including Congress. Okay? So presidents rarely vetoed, and it governed John Adams' thought when he signed on to two bills that my middle school students have just learned about, the Alien and Sedition Acts during the undeclared war with France, which probably cost John Adams his presidency, his being reelected to the president. All right. Now, parties came out of that. You have to understand, George Washington was so sad about this. He hated political parties, but more than anything, he had all these guys who had been his colleagues during the war. You know, he had Thomas Jefferson, who'd been negotiating a peace over in France. He had Alexander Hamilton, who asked him to make the last charge in the last battle at Yorktown. You know, all these people were his colleagues, and here they were, opponents. In fact, still the dirtiest election in American history is the election of 1800 between John Adams and the Federalist Party and Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party. Okay, so that's real divided government. I mean, the kind of things they threw around there were pretty shocking. And in the end, because of opposition to the Federalists, who many people felt were acting too elitist, and particularly the Alien and Sedition Acts, which was putting newspaper publishers in jail for publishing columns critical of Adams and the Federalist Party for not having peace with France during this undeclared war. So that cost the Federalists the election. The party dies 16 years later, and somebody else said, what about the Whig Party? And for a while, you did not have another party. There was actually a couple of years there where there was only one party. And it's known in history books as, I don't know how many you've heard this before. It's known in history books as the era of good feelings. Okay? It lasts for a couple of years. And then the party started fracturing by location. You know, John Quincy Adams was a Republican, but he was a nationalist Republican. They were up in New England. They were former Federalists. And then there were the Southern Republicans. And then there were the Midwesterns. And so eventually it breaks up. But all these things happen because there are differences in opinion about the direction of the country and what the Constitution means. And they all felt that those were battles worth fighting politically. Okay. Now, eventually, it's going to get to a point where they've tried to put it together with spit glue and baling wire, and you get a civil war. Okay. But it's the seeds of that happening early on in the country's history. So, no real opposition party until Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson changes everything. He's one of the reasons that we have some of the splits that we have in our political system. Because, for one, the voting laws had started changing right before he ran for president the second time. You had property requirements ending. Up to that point in time, you couldn't vote unless you owned property. And people said, well, that's not right. That's elitist. Yes, but you think of it their way, the only people who were paying taxes are property owners. So since they're paying taxes, they should be the ones who elect representatives who decide how their tax money is going to be spent. Now, I tell the kids this, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And when I talk to adults about this who didn't know this, they kind of go, really? We didn't have an income tax. We didn't have an income tax for a long time. We had to amend the Constitution in order to have an income tax. It was part of the Progressive Revolution, was the path to make. And Lincoln tried to put one out there in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court said, nope, that's unconstitutional. So they didn't try again. So eventually you had an amendment. And the reason that happened was really simple, because you can't have guys like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan making tens of millions of dollars in cash every year and not paying any taxes. So eventually, this is the great part I love about this. Okay, so the first income tax, it's on anybody who makes more than $5,000, and it's 2%. Things have changed. Anyway. So the property requirement ends. Now you need to respond to a new group, aspiring men. Okay, they don't have property yet, but they want to. You know, they want to make something of themselves. And so the greatest example they know of a guy who came from nothing and made himself wealthy and famous is Andrew Jackson. Even though he's a very wealthy man, he was considered the man of the people. And that's how he gets elected. And you got all these immigrants that are starting to come now, and they're going to vote for Andrew Jackson because he's the symbol of upward mobility in the United States of America. And so they're all over Andrew Jackson and supporting him. And they become Jacksonian Democrats. Okay, Jacksonian Democrats. And then bringing all these immigrants here because they'd heard all the stories. Now, Jackson's enemies were the elites. The people who, a lot of people have made some comparisons, and there's some comparisons that fit there, that Donald Trump is very Jacksonian in his approach to his run for the presidency. Here's a multi-billionaire who was getting support from, the working class people because they looked at him and saw that he treated them as people who are contributing something, as opposed to ignoring them because they didn't go to the right school, they didn't speak the right kind of language and that sort of thing. So Jackson's the same way. One of my favorite Jackson quotes I tell the kids, I don't trust anyone who only has one way to spell a word. I know that could be a little problem in the department over there, but that is something that he said. And so Jackson immediately is going to cause a split. But the fact of the matter is, he is the majority part of that split. Here's the picture I talked to you about them calling him King Andrew. It says King Andrew the First down there at the bottom, and then born to command, and let's see, what does he say? I've been insulted, and veto power, and he's got his foot on the Constitution. And of course, this made him very mad. He says, I'm very constitutional. Anyway, he had a frequent use of executive orders. He was constantly reinterpreting the boundaries of his executive powers. He was censured by the Senate. The Senate said, we censure him. The president's acting like a king. And he considered that a badge of honor. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And he went to war with the Bank of the United States, which was being used in a corrupt fashion by the people who were running it. So what he did is he starved them of federal funds. All tariffs were supposed to come into the Bank of the United States. He just said, from now on, the tariffs will not come into the Bank of the United States. And it doesn't take very long for a bank to run out of money when that happens. Now, you talked about the Whig Party. The Whig Party was, say again?
I thought he just vetoed its recharter
right.
or something.
Right.
Okay.
But before he even had that part happen to it, he was just, first thing to do is cut off the money. Second thing to do is kill the charter. Okay. Anyway, so the Whig Party was the opposition party, and all the Whig Party was known for was basically being opposed to Jackson and the Democrats and the people that came after him. Now, when we come to after the Civil War, the kind of divided government, it almost didn't make any difference whether it was Republican or Democrats, because all of them were kind of at the beck and call of the interests in their region, the interests in their state. If I'm in Pennsylvania, I got to make sure John D. Rockefeller's happy, and Andrew Carnegie gets as much steel as he needs to get done. And so you had all these different businesses that were run by trusts, which were put together by these rich men to be able to accumulate all these different industries, so that if I'm John D. Rockefeller, not only do I have 90% of the oil in the country, which Standard Oil did, but I also control the railroads that it runs on. I control the price I pay the railroad for how much that oil is going to get transported. I'm going to have all the gas stations that are starting to spring up now to provide gasoline. Those are going to be Standard Oil stations. If there's somebody with a competitor, I'm going to put them out of business. And so you really have a time where it's not so divided. Now, the Republicans are in control for a long time, so they don't have to worry much about a Democratic Party. Why is that? Because they had not yet readmitted where the majority of Democratic Party votes were coming from, which was the former Confederacy. So until the Confederate States were readmitted to the Union, you didn't have much of a Democratic opposition to the Republicans when they were in Congress during that time. So the country in the late 19th century is largely controlled by business interests or a growing labor union interest. In some of those states, the labor unions are the ones who are able to organize the voters out there. And so those are the ones you have to answer to. So they're really going to determine what kind of legislation is going to go through, and the president sign it. And that's why you don't hear a lot about, what did Grover Cleveland do? What did Benjamin Harrison do? What did Garfield do? What did Chester Arthur do? All these people. Because pretty much it was to sign whatever this Congress passed through during that period of time. Now, things are going to change, and they do change particularly strongly during the New Deal. When Roosevelt comes to power in 1933, it's an emergency situation. And so we need to concentrate power in the federal government in order to be able to help people quickly and get relief out to them, as they were saying during that time. Now, this was an emergency. So some people said, well, okay, but this is an emergency, and after the emergency is over, it will go back to normal. Power usually doesn't do that. Once it gets to some place, it likes staying where it is. Now, in the 1932 landslide win and takeover of Congress, that was a big switch. Before that period of time, when Hoover was first elected in 28, he had a Republican Congress, and of course, he was a Republican in the White House. They lost Congress in 1930 and lost everything else, including adding to the Democratic margins in the 1932 win. They added on a lot in 1934. So it really was a situation where he had a super majorities almost in both houses as he got the New Deal going in 1934. And then one landslide re-election in 1936. People felt that things were getting better and that Roosevelt's policies were part of that. Where things get interesting is 1938. As good a politician as he is, FDR was human. And he made the mistake in 1938 of trying to replace some of the Southern Democrats who were not as excited about some of the moving things towards socialism, some of the things that would move towards labor union permission. That was something they wanted to keep out of the South. And so he would go and try to fund people to run in the primaries because they weren't going to elect Republicans. He knew he didn't have to worry about that. Whoever was going to be the Democratic nominee was going to be the senator or congressman down south. And so he was trying to replace some of these congressmen who've been dragging their feet in some of the more liberal parts of his policies. And that backfired on him. And so now in 1938, while you still had a Democrat Congress and you still had a Democrat in the White House, for the first time you had divided government by ideology. Historians mark the end of the New Deal with the 1938 election. Because anything that people felt was going too far, Republicans would unite with Southern Democrats and stop it in the Congress. So there are no New Deal alphabet agencies after the 1938 election. And my own theory is that had it not been for World War II, I'm not sure whether Franklin Roosevelt would have run for a third term. But he was able to convince people, you know, this is different. There's a war going on. It's going to affect us. You need somebody experienced to run.
In 1940, we weren't in World War.
We weren't, but we knew there was a world war. We needed somebody who's going to be able to handle all this.
Okay.
And so the idea was we need someone experienced. And who were the Republicans running? A businessman, Wendell Willkie. And so he didn't have the foreign policy experience or the long-term sitting in the White House, making decisions that Roosevelt did. That was actually, though, his closest election. Of the four elections he won, the 1941 wasn't that close, but it was closer. And I believe part of that was because a lot of people felt, as I said earlier, 2 terms is enough for George Washington. It should be enough for any president. Later on, we made a constitutional change, so nobody can have more than 2 terms. Somebody had a hand up?
My grandfather said the exact same thing.
Yeah, said a lot of people did who probably would have voted for him anyway, maybe, or not. Some of them Republicans used as a reason that people should vote Republican. But there were Democrats who normally would have supported Roosevelt who just felt that, 2 terms is enough for any person. So after World War II, you've had a lot of fatigue. You've had the Democrats in control since the landslide election in 1932, and the Republicans wanted to win the midterms. And so they ran on a 2-word campaign, had enough. And in 1946, the Republicans took over the Congress. And Truman, all the problems were Truman. Everybody loved FDR, but we're going to blame Truman for everything. And we're going to come in and try to change things. And Truman used this against them. He did a little jujitsu. Because the Republicans were not able to do anything, just like this Congress will not be able to do anything. Because if you got something Republicans like and you actually somehow got the senators to go along with it, Biden would probably veto it. And that's what Truman was saying. I'm going to veto anything you're doing, which is wrong. And then he turned around and blamed the Republicans in 1948, saying they were a do-nothing Congress. And vote for me and vote Democrat for Congress, and we'll get things moving again. And the other thing the Republicans did is get the Taft-Hartley Act through, which was to limit labor union power. So right off the bat, Truman was also able to say, the Republicans are anti-union, so you don't want to vote for them. And that's one of the reasons that Truman had this surprising victory in 1948. We've all seen the famous, newspaper, Dewey defeats Truman and all that sort of stuff. He enjoyed that a lot. Unfortunately, that was about the high point of his second term. Because shortly after that happened Korea, and Korea did the same thing to his presidency that Vietnam did to Lyndon Johnson's presidency. All right, Korea does Truman in. Ike jumps in as a Republican. They were going to try to persuade Truman not to run for election in 1948. They wanted Eisenhower to run. Eisenhower said, "I have a job. I'm over here running NATO. I'm happy to be over here." But there was some thought that both parties were courting Eisenhower because he had stayed fairly apolitical while he was in the army. And then eventually he comes out and figures, I'm closer to the Republicans than anything. And the Eisenhower years will be the last time the Republicans will control the House of Representatives for 40 years. Okay? So he gets control during that time. Now, you ask yourself, why did that happen? The New Deal coalition is going to hold together for the next 4 decades. Largely based on the fact that the Democrats are now saying we are the party of labor, we're the party of minorities, we're the party of blue-collar women who are trying to strike out and have a work of their own, the urban middle class and lower class dwellers in the cities, they are voting Democrat. And so that's why so much of the House is going to be Democrat, because remember, what is the House? Based on population. So all those urban dwellers are voting in Democrats into office. And this is also when money starts to become a problem. Television is starting to become a need. Newspapers, advertisements, travel, and so you need money. And where do you go to get money? You're going to go a lot of times to labor unions. They're going to be able to help you out with the money that they pooled for the dues from their members. So what's going to change that? The Gingrich Revolution in 1994. For 40 years, Democrats had controlled the House. A lot of things fell into their pockets. They started making some inroads in the South during the Reagan years, largely on anti-communism being something that a lot of people in the South were voting for Ronald Reagan for. And so you actually started getting Southerners who were voting Republican. And then the results after Vietnam, the culture changes that came after that, began also to turn Southerners more and more Republican. So the Republicans are starting to build a base in the South. At the same time, they're losing the old Republican areas up in Maine and New Hampshire and some of these other states in New England that now are solidly Democrat, but at the time had been more Republicans that gotten their votes. When Gingrich put forth the contract with America, he was also playing on something that happened during that time. And that was, you had a House banking scandal, you had a House post office scandal, and he said, we're going to come in and clean some of that stuff up. So you had the first balanced budgets in years. You had 4 balanced budgets in a row from 1994 to 1998, and we haven't come close to anything like that since then. You had welfare reform that they negotiated with and got a signature from President Clinton with on this. So Clinton saw, this is in my best interest to find some areas where I can work together with Congress here. And so you saw welfare reform. So Clinton embraced this and made it like, yeah, I'm gonna do some of this too, and signed a lot of the things and took an easy re-election in 1996 because he was seen as somewhat center. Okay, and that's one of the reasons that he got reelected in 1996. Finally, the 2010 Tea Party response to the Obama presidency. Initially, it was partially an attempt to stop Obamacare. Remember the big deal about Scott Brown taking the Teddy Kennedy seat in Massachusetts, and that would be the vote that needed to keep on the filibuster to keep Obamacare from going through, but they found a way around that anyway. And then they got bailed out when Justice Roberts joined the Democrats on the court in calling Obamacare not a change in plan, but a tax. And once that happened, then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The tax was because of the individual mandate, which was repealed as part of the tax.
But it hasn't killed Obamacare.
Yeah, but if that same case made its way through the court
It probably
again,
would, yeah.
It would
be a different.
Because, and they can cite Roberts' ruling as calling a tax to the individual mandate.
I don't think the court's going to take this one up again. I think they're going to say, Congress is going to fix that. We're not touching that one again, especially not what happened with the Hobbs decision. All right. So you're right. And it exposed a really evenly divided government at that time. And again, a lot of that became more and more ideological. So the fourth branch of the American government is the news media. And as we've seen from the Twitter files that have been released, if you haven't read about that yet, I strongly urge you to read Matt Taibbi's reports on it. You can find them in a lot of different places. You can Google it and find it. This is a guy who used to write for Rolling Stone, so he's not like a hardcore right-winger. But he's seen a lot of the documents that have come out of the Twitter files and talked about the hand-in-glove relationship between people at the FBI and the CIA and the way they were manipulating Twitter to control people's visibility on the website. The constant request for banning of opposition accounts. When government's involved, it is a First Amendment violation. And that's been the question all along. Well, Twitter can do whatever they want. They're a private company. Yes, unless the government is putting pressure on them to do this. Then it's just a false front being used by the government to restrict First Amendment rights, and particularly in a political sense. And then that's trying to affect an election, which is what happened there. So last slide. So starting in 2023, we have, once again, divided government. We have a very narrow Republican majority in the House, 4 or 5 seats, depending on what happens that day. We have a 1-vote majority by the Democrats in the Senate. Neither party right now feels like it wants to compromise with the other. They've already had about maybe 10 votes, and I think 6 of those 10s have been strictly along party lines to the individual. And so it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of compromise here. Now, this is kind of part of the hardwiring that's going on in our government right now. People are afraid of being called out on social media. People are afraid of being attacked on, I don't know if you call them news reports, I guess the 24-hour news channels or whatever, on one side or another. But the bureaucracy is where a lot of things have gone on. And over time, the bureaucracy has been such that it's so hard to fire somebody. So you get a tendency after a certain amount of time that bureaucracy is going to represent the people who've been appointing to them to the bureaucracy and creating new agencies to expand the size of the bureaucracy. And that's largely been the Democratic Party over the last number of years. So what will happen now? Well, November 2024 will be really important because then you're going to see what direction people want to go. If it's once again one of these split 1 or 2 vote things, it's going to be some rough sailing. But I kind of think that people again, I encourage people to get involved on the grassroots level of things, to get involved in your school boards, to get involved in your, go to a council meeting and see what's going on with these things. Some of them are online. Find out what's going locally, because those are the people that in 8 to 10 years are going to be in your Congress and your Senate. Okay, that's the farm club. What's going on right now at our lower levels. And I know I've gone a little long here, but I'm happy to take a few questions if you like. Yes.
I got 2 questions, Keith. You mentioned that at the beginning that they said in Philadelphia, we're going to have 2 houses. But this is before they decided on, the form that we have now. Why did they think they would have 2 houses then?
I think.
Know the answer.
Yeah. The question is, why did they said early on they were going to have 2 houses, and then how did it get to this compromise where the 2 houses, one by population, one by state?
Why did they say 2 houses? Just because they had a House of Lords and a House of...
I think they knew somehow they were going to have one house, which was going to, they had already decided that was going to have a longer term. And so those are people that you treasure, that are experienced, that you want to come there and be there for a while. They know how the plan operates, sort of thing. Before they knew that what they were going to be is representative of the states. Someone made the obvious connection. Well, if these guys are going to be here longer, and these guys are experienced guys, then that should be whoever your state thinks. And remember, people didn't elect senators until the same time period where the income tax was brought in. You had the 17th Amendment that changes the way senators are chosen.
That was gonna be my question.
Yeah, senators were chosen by the legislatures. I always have fun with the kids when we talk about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, because Lincoln knew he wasn't going to win. It wasn't possible. His party had only been around a couple of years. The Democrats dominated the Illinois state legislature. Everybody knew they were going to send Stephen Douglas back. People weren't going to vote on that. People only voted on who was in our state legislature. But it gave Lincoln a chance to make a name for himself, to poke some holes in Douglas, and he was already thinking of running in 1860. So for him, it was a good way to test it. But the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. So when they end up making that change, all the really the biggest part of the change was saying each state's going to get 2 of these. We knew there were going to be guys who were going to be a longer term and guys that we expected to be, the kind of mainly older people with experience. As you look at the senator, what's the requirement? I think it's 30. You look at a congressman, you have to be 25. Yeah, 30, I think is 35, I think is the president, is it? Yeah. President's 35, the senator's 30, I think, and the Congress is 25. So the idea is definitely, we don't mind if some younger guys come as congressmen, they're one of many. And they're going to learn, and they're going to find out, for instance, who's the most popular guy in the Republican Party right now other than Donald Trump? It's Ron DeSantis, who had 2, I think almost 3 terms as a congressman a number of years ago, after he served his time as a judge advocate general in the Navy. So that's a place a lot of times where people go to get some experience. Even Lincoln had 1 term in Congress as a congressman before he became president. So, yeah.
Do you consider executive orders tyranny of majority?
I think, the question is, do I consider executive orders tyranny of the majority? I think Congress is wise, no matter who's in there, Republican, Democrat, whatever, to push back on executive orders. Because if they don't, they're just ceding ground. And they've already been doing that for a while. Congress has become a way to set yourself up for the future. And people know this about them. And even some of them in their heart of hearts know this about them. And they've let their power kind of get frittered away. They give a lot of it to the bureaucracy because they don't want to make those decisions. And they give some of it to the president to have executive orders because they don't want to get involved in a sticky wicket or something like that. But they should push back on that. Too much of their power has been taken away. And I think the founders thought that Congress would push back on it. I tell the kids, in the first half of the 18th century, leading up to the Civil War, other than Andrew Jackson, presidents are not the ones that we're talking about. Most presidents, if you didn't know about the Monroe Doctrine, you would know who Monroe. It's Monroe. Who was that? Who was Martin Van Buren? Who were some of these people? Because the power was in Congress. The people who were powerful in the first half of the 19th century were Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster, guys who were known, who were in their 30, 40. I mean, Daniel Clay and Calhoun were part of the War Hawks that made the War of 1812 happen. And their last hurrah is in 1850, trying to keep the Civil War from happening in 1850 and giving us 10 more years before it happens by the Compromise of 1850. So they had been in there a long time and were powerful men. And people would sit there, and this is the thing I tell the kids about, they shake their heads. People would come there and listen to them, just sit there and listen to them talk for 2 hours. There's nobody these kids would listen to for 2 hours. Okay, maybe Harry Styles if he came by or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, what I'm talking about. They would listen to these people talk because they were great orators and they had in their mind their viewpoint and the history to support their viewpoint and the logic to support it. And so you would learn by listening to Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun if you didn't agree with them. So that's where they thought the power was going to be, was in Congress. And I think we need to grab that back. Yeah.
So you're saying the 40 years from like 52 to 92, the Republicans control the House.
The Republicans did not have control of the House from the last time they had control of it during Eisenhower until Newt Gingrich's revolution in 1994. There was 40 years of Democratic rule of the House, uninterrupted during that time.
I misunderstood.
Yeah,
So
I trip over my words, so that's probably not your problem.
The Democrats were in control
Of the House of Representatives for 40 years.
from 52
From, I think it was closer to 58, maybe. I think in his second term, he got the House for like 2 years then. But I mean, even at those times, it would have been really close. During this time when the Democrats had control, it was a huge amount of control. And you remember some of those people. Jim Wright, Tip O'Neill. Okay, these were the guys who got things done. And when they didn't have control of the White House, when a Nixon or a Ford or something like that was in the White House, then they could make deals with them. And that's what you did. I'll get this guy on this committee and you'll put this bill into action and sign it, whatever. And that's the way they did things. We've stopped doing that long ago. It's all or nothing these days. And a lot of it's because of pressure groups who make things look like they're a more powerful force than they are because they're noisy. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, two-part question.
Sure.
Talking about the 17th Amendment, what was the genesis? If hindsight is 2020 was a mistake, elected senators.
All right, hold on. The first question is, what's the genesis of the 17th Amendment? There are a slew of those amendments that happened in that period of time that are part of what's called the Progressive Era, which really is born out of Robert La Follette and a lot of the people in Wisconsin and things that they started experimenting there. The states have always been experimental places for new ideas in our national union. Okay, right now, the state that starts things off a lot of times is California. If it's happening in California, sooner or later, it's going to start happening in other states, okay? You keep an eye on how this reparation thing goes on in California, which is amazing because you never had slavery in California. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. So the 17th Amendment, part of that was we want more democracy, not less in our country. And so rather than have the state legislatures who are going to pick one of their old buddies who's been in the state legislature for 20 years, and now we're going to send him to Washington, D.C. as a senator, we're going to have the people at large elect them just like they elect their congressman and vote for the president. That was the
deal in William Clark in Montana, that when they became a state in 1908 or whatever it was, that they had he had basically bought himself a Senate seat,
sort of like the Dutton family in Yellowstone.
And then like there was a big kerfuffle about it, and then the lieutenant governor waited till the governor was out of the state. He withdraws, and then the lieutenant governor appoints him to the same seat he just so now he just.
But just remember, the easiest way to get something like this done is to make what seems an obvious appeal to fairness. This is one of the things I tell the kids all night. One of the number one complaints you hear in the playground is, that's not fair. We got to do this over again. I'm like, Americans we're just crazy about fairness. You go in other countries that go, life isn't fair, so what else isn't? They're used to that. When Americans, we're going to legislate it all. But anyway, the point I'm making is that when the 17th Amendment came through, it wasn't a very hard sell to say, hey, we're going to have the people choose the senator rather than just these legislators who've been sitting up there for 20, 30 years and been patting each other on the back and doing sweetheart deals and all that sort of thing. And so that's how the 17th Amendment was able to easily get its 38 states to agree to ratify it and put it in the Constitution. So you had the 16th, which I believe is the income tax one, the 17th, which is senators, the 18th, which is prohibition. That was a thing that had been going on in temperance unions for a long time. The 19th gives the vote to women. That's how it came about. Did you you said you had two parts, or did I answer both parts of my answer?
The second part, which hindsight being 2020 was it correct?
Right. I probably one of the number one suggested repeal of an amendment that I hear today is the 17th. And again, the reason that the framers did it is they looked at it and said, these again are the people who are being sent to their state legislatures because they know what people in our district want. They know what people in their counties want. And that they would know who would be a good representative to represent the views of that state, because everybody in that legislature knows what the problems are in their state, to go to Washington, D.C. and be a senator to represent their state. Okay. Anything else? Have I gone on too long?
Plus, it was a further check and balance between the states and the federal government
Yes.
at large.
Yes.
Which is gone now.
Hey, we're again. This is one of the things that here's how I get to give the pitch. This is why this school is so important. This school is about knowledge. It's not, I don't want kids coming out thinking and having the opinions the same way I do. I want to give them enough information they can think it through themselves because they've got the information. And some of them are going to agree with me, some are wrong. I have one of my students years ago is about as far away from me in just about everything as possible. He's been a legislator up in Washington State for a long time, but he was one of my students and he's smart and he knows what it is. He came to different conclusions. Great. Then I have another kid who's run for Congress a couple of times. He's been an aide to some major people out in Washington State. He's at the opposite end of the spectrum. And, and a lot in between, because the key thing is what these future voters, my middle school kids are going to be voting probably in the 2028 election, maybe. So that's the way I look at them. They're future voters. They need to have the background, the knowledge, they need to know how their country works, how it's designed, how it's worked in the past, and the things that haven't worked in the past, the people are still trying to convince them will work. Socialism never going to work. Humans, never mind. I'll be out here another hour. Anyway, so we're very great. I'm very grateful for your support. I'm very grateful for coming out tonight. Very grateful for your support of Classical Academy de Lafayette, and I appreciate you joining us here tonight. Thank you.
Questions on the WebEx? You might have questions on the WebEx too.
If we knew how to monitor that, we would do that. That will come when we have an IT department. Sorry, I'm just not qualified to do that. I will just add, thank you, first of all. I will just add that I feel Mr. Preston and our history, what we teach, is the most important thing we are doing at Cal, besides phonics, besides Latin, besides math, all of these things, math, yes. But it's crucial that these kids know how this country works. And the goal has been from the very get-go, how to think, not what to think, and then to have these students who are nurtured by these independent thoughts and ideas to go out and defend all of these rights that we hold so dear. It's the most important thing. And that's why we're doing this. And we're grateful that you're participating in this. I know I've learned a ton tonight. We're just so grateful. We're grateful for Mr. Preston. We're grateful for all of you online. And I would say that what gives me hope is that the character that we're also teaching here, it's going to counteract. It does counteract the feckless ambition that seems to be running rampant today. And we nurture that here, and we encourage it every day. So, and what a joy it must be to learn from this guy every day. I'm jealous of all the middle schoolers and the high schooler that you get to teach. So in any case, tonight's session is recorded. It was recorded, and we're going to send that out in about a week or two. So be on the lookout for that. Share it, please. And thank you again for sharing this gift of history with us tonight, Mr. Preston, and thank all of you. Have a great night.